Imagine living in a society where grilling the wrong type of meat for dinner isn't just like a dietary mistake. It's actually an act of high treason that could get you permanently exiled.
Right, or where just giving a dismissive eye roll to your father carries the exact same legal weight as committing murder.
Yeah, it's intense. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Before we step fully into this ancient, uncompromising, and frankly shocking world, I want to offer a warm divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May you find clarity, peace, and purpose in whatever you're stepping into right now.
Absolutely.
We have a really heavy, deeply fascinating stack of sources in front of us today. We're looking directly into Leviticus chapter 20, drawing heavily from the insights and study notes of the Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible. Okay, let's unpack this if you're familiar with the broader terrain of Leviticus. You know that chapter 18 just laid out this massive, detailed list of boundaries.
Right, the strict what not to do list regarding sexual morality and pagan practices.
Exactly. But chapter 20, this is the consequence chapter. We're moving away from just establishing the boundaries, and we're diving into the severe, uncompromising enforcement of them.
Yeah, and to understand why these penalties are so breathtakingly severe to a modern reader, we really have to look at the theological machinery operating beneath the surface of the text. These aren't just random civic codes drawn out of a hat by some ancient king. Fundamentally, this entire framework is built on a very specific definition of holiness.
Right, because today you and I probably hear the word holy and think of someone who is, I don't know, highly moral or maybe just quietly spiritual.
Exactly. But in the context of Leviticus, holiness means absolute physical and geographical separation. It is about drawing extreme, bright lines to keep a very specific group of people, the Israelites, entirely distinct from the surrounding nations.
So it's about survival, really.
Yes, the threat of assimilation, of like blending in with their neighbors culturally or spiritually, it's treated as an absolute existential threat to their survival and to their covenant with God.
Which explains why the stakes are unimaginably high. Leviticus doesn't ease the reader in with minor infractions. It goes straight for the heaviest prohibitions imaginable.
Right, giving one's children to Molech and turning to necromancers, mediums, or spiritists.
Yeah, and the punishment outlined here for Molech worship, which historically involved offering a child as a sacrifice to this pagan deity, is absolute. It's death by stoning. And it has to be carried out by the people of the land, meaning the community itself must physically pick up the stones.
Right, and that communal aspect is vital to understanding the ancient mindset. The burden of maintaining this extreme boundary isn't outsourced to, like, a professional police force.
Right, you can't just call 911.
Exactly. It's placed squarely on the shoulders of the neighborhood. It forces the society to actively, physically participate in rejecting these foreign practices. Because if the community tolerates the corruption, well, the community becomes complicit.
But there is this fascinating legal, or rather theological failsafe built right into the instructions. Leviticus outlines a scenario where the community might hesitate.
Yeah, which is a very human reaction.
Right. If the people of the land close their eyes to the person who gave their child to Molech, if they look the other way, maybe out of fear, or maybe because Molech worship was becoming dangerously popular.
Or politically protected, yeah.
Exactly. And if they fail to execute the offender, God himself steps in. He declares he will turn his face against that person, against their family, and against all their followers, eliminating them from the community entirely.
What's fascinating here is how the NWA study notes highlight the underlying theology of that specific failsafe. Verse 8 explicitly says, I am the Lord who sanctifies you.
Wow.
Yeah, God is positioned as the ultimate active agent of this sanctification. The community is supposed to act as his representatives, but if they fail, his authority remains absolute. He will enforce the boundary himself.
That's terrifying.
It is. And we see this exact same principle applied to the occult practices mentioned right alongside Molech worship. Consulting a necromancer or a medium isn't viewed as just a spooky parlor trick, It completely bypasses God's authority.
You know, the best way I can wrap my modern head around this is by thinking of it through the lens of high treason in a kingdom.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Like, if you live in a sovereign nation and you start paying taxes to a rival king, or in this horrific case, offering your actual children to a rival king like Moloch, that isn't just a personal moral failing, it's treason.
Okay.
And seeking out necromancers or mediums, that's like a citizen seeking illicit military intelligence from a foreign hostile agency instead of trusting their own sovereign ruler. It's an act of open rebellion.
Viewing it as political and spiritual treason really clarifies the severity of the response. You are abandoning your king and going to a rival source for truth or power.
Yeah.
And the text repeats, with intense emphasis, that the penalty for turning to a necromancer is ultimately death by stoning. The NWA notes point out how striking it is that this condemnation is finalized with capital punishment.
Because it places a spiritual offense on the exact same legal tier as the worst physical crimes.
Precisely. Once the absolute sovereignty of the divine king is established, the laws immediately cascade down to the next layer of authority.
And this is where a modern reader might experience some serious whiplash, honestly. We move from treason against God to treason against the foundational unit of society, the family.
Right.
Leviticus draws a hard line here. The penalty for cursing a father or mother is death. Now, the NAA notes provide some crucial context here, clarifying what cursing actually means in this ancient setting.
Because it doesn't mean muttering a bad word under your breath when you're frustrated.
Right, no. It translates closer to making light of or treating them with profound condescension.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite of the commandment to honor your father and mother found earlier in Exodus. The Hebrew concept of honor involves giving weight to someone, treating them as heavy and significant.
Okay.
So, to curse them means to treat them as weightless, as nothing. In a patriarchal tribal society, the parents are the literal link to the past, the title deed to the land, and the chain connecting the current generation to the covenant with God.
Wow, so destroying that authority fractures the entire social structure.
Exactly.
I genuinely struggle, though, with grouping a condescending attitude toward a parent with capital crimes. But, I mean, if I apply that high treason lens we used earlier, is this essentially attacking the local governors of the kingdom? Like, if God is the ultimate sovereign king, the parents are his delegated embassy on earth.
That is the perfect way to understand the ancient logic. If you topple the local embassy, the kingdom eventually falls. A society that treats its foundational link to the past as weightless has no future.
Right. Which explains why the laws regarding sexual morality follow immediately after. We see a repetition of the specific prohibitions from Chapter 18 laws against adultery, various complex forms of incest, homosexuality, and bestiality.
But now with specific terrifying penalties attached.
Exactly. With bestiality, the text explicitly notes that the animal involved is to be killed as well, ensuring a total eradication of the act. And the reason these sexual boundaries are so extreme is tied back to that existential threat of assimilation. In the ancient Near East, engaging in these practices often mirrored the fertility cults and social structures of the surrounding Canaanites or the Egyptians. If the Israelites adopted those practices, their distinct, separated identity would just dissolve within a single generation.
They would completely cease to be a holy people. The extreme boundaries of holiness require extreme measures to maintain them. And we see different tiers of punishment across these offenses to reflect the perceived severity of the disruption.
Right, like stoning.
Yeah, there is death, often by stoning. There is burning, which is specifically prescribed for the extreme case of a man marrying both a woman and her mother, which destroys the foundational family unit twice over.
Gosh.
And then there's this other category of being cut off or dying childless.
And this requires a deeper look, I think. Because to a modern listener, dying childless might just sound like an unfortunate biological reality, not a terrifying legal penalty handed down by a divine court.
Right.
But the Holman study notes are incredibly helpful here in shifting our perspective. In this ancient patriarchal society, your legacy, your survival into the future, and your family's hold on your ancestral land were entirely dependent on having descendants.
This raises an important question about the ancient concept of the afterlife and legacy. Without children, your name, your memory, and your portion in the community were essentially deleted from the timeline.
Wow. Deleted.
Yeah, to be rendered sterile was viewed culturally as a profound divine retribution. It wasn't just a physical condition, it was an extinguishing of your future existence.
It's a complete biological and historical erasure. And another phrase that pops up frequently alongside these severe punishments is, his blood is on his own head. The NAA translates this concept to mean the offender is entirely responsible for their own demise.
That phrase reinforces how responsibility and guilt were understood in this framework. The boundary was clearly marked. The consequences were known.
Yeah.
If you crossed that line, you weren't a victim of an arbitrary judicial system. Right. You brought the consequence upon yourself. It was a deliberate act of self-destruction. But you brought up the punishment of childlessness, and we really need to add an essential layer of nuance there.
Right, because I have to assume the ancient Israelites looked around and saw perfectly righteous people struggling with infertility. How did they reconcile this severe legal penalty with the reality of daily life?
Right, and the Holman notes crucially clarify that we shouldn't take this legal penalty to mean that sterility in the Bible was universally viewed as a punishment for sin.
Oh, good.
The biblical narrative is actually full of profound nuance on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
The notes cite examples of incredibly righteous but initially barren women. You have Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah in the Old Testament, and Elizabeth in the New Testament.
Right, of course.
In those cases, their initial childlessness was absolutely not a penalty for violating Leviticus 20. It was a prelude to a miraculous intervention by God to demonstrate his power. So while childlessness could be a specific penal consequence for certain severe boundary violations, a deliberate timeline deletion, it was not a blanket diagnosis for every single person experiencing infertility.
That's a really vital distinction to make. It ensures we don't misapply the specific legal penalties of Leviticus as universal rules for human suffering.
Exactly.
But let's keep zooming out because all of these individual incredibly harsh laws, the executions, the excommunications, the timeline erasures, they all build toward a grand overarching warning for the entire nation. Leviticus doesn't just hand down a list of codes, it issues a terrifying ultimatum. It says the Israelites must keep all these statutes and judgments so that the land they are entering does not vomit you out.
It is one of the most visceral, unforgettable images in the entire biblical text.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. Right after this terrifying warning about the land vomiting them out, there is a sudden, seemingly abrupt pivot in the text.
Oh, yeah.
We just went through this intense, heavy list of sexual immorality, the occult, and family structure laws, and suddenly the focus shifts entirely to distinguishing between clean and unclean animals.
Right.
It says, "You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals and between unclean and clean birds." And then it immediately reiterates the promise they are inheriting a land flowing with milk and honey.
To a modern reader, jumping from capital incest laws to the dinner menu feels like a complete non sequitur.
Yeah, it feels really disorganized.
But to the ancient mind, it is a completely unified thought.
Let me offer an analogy for how I'm picturing this warning about the land, just to see if we can bridge that gap. Today, you, the listener, probably view land as real estate. It's dirt, property lines, geographical coordinates, maybe a mortgage.
Sure.
But Leviticus views the promised land as a living biological organism, like a human body with an active, highly sensitive immune system. When you eat something entirely toxic, let's say severe food poisoning, your body doesn't politely ask the bacteria to leave.
No, it violently expels it.
Exactly. It vomits it out to save the host. The land itself is described as having a moral immune system. The previous nations who lived there engaged in Molech worship, incest, the occult, and the land became sick.
Oh.
It is currently vomiting them out. The warning to the Israelites is crystal clear. If you act like the toxins, the immune system of the land will expel you too.
That's a great way to put it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sudden switch to dietary laws makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The strict daily physical separation of clean and unclean animals in their diet is meant to be a constant living mirror of God's strict separation of Israel from the other nations. Look closely at verses 24 through 26. God says, "I am the Lord your God who has set you apart for the nations."
Okay.
And in the very next breath, you must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals.
Oh, wow. So their dinner plate is a physical representation of their national identity. Every single time they sit down to eat a meal, they are rehearsing their separation from the surrounding cultures. They're basically practicing holiness with their forks.
Precisely. Holiness isn't just a private spiritual state of mind you achieve during quiet meditation. In this worldview, holiness is deeply physical. It's dietary. It's geographical.
It's everything.
You are separated unto God in your worship, in your civic duties, in your bedroom, and in your kitchen. And the reward for maintaining this extreme, holistic separation is living in that land flowing with milk and honey.
You know, we hear that phrase so often on greeting cards and in songs that it completely loses its meaning. It just sounds like poetic exaggeration for, like, A nice place with good weather.
It really does, but the NAA study notes actually bring in a surprising historical detail here that grounds this famous phrase in hard reality.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they point to ancient Egyptian texts, specifically something called the Story of Sinuhe. This is a famous Egyptian narrative from the Middle Kingdom period, centuries before the events of Leviticus.
Okay.
In it, Sinuhe, an Egyptian official, flees his homeland and travels to the land of Canaan. And he describes it in his writings as an incredibly productive, fertile place. He specifically mentions it being exceptionally rich in figs, grapes, wine, honey, olives, and massive herds of cattle.
Wow. So an Egyptian official, someone from a massively powerful, wealthy empire built around the Nile, is writing home essentially saying, you wouldn't believe how lush and productive this place is.
Exactly. The story of Sinuhe provides independent, secular corroboration of the biblical claim. Flowing with milk and honey wasn't just ancient marketing or a spiritual metaphor.
Right.
It was an internationally recognized description of the land's actual tangible agricultural wealth. For a nomadic, tribal people like the Israelites, who had just spent generations in slavery in the wilderness, this was the ultimate prize.
The stakes couldn't be clearer. Maintain this intense, all-encompassing holiness, and you get to live in this incredibly rich, fertile, internationally famous land, break the holiness, act like the surrounding nations, become a moral toxin, and this beautiful land will literally spit you out. So what does this all mean? If we try to tie all these diverse threads together from our deep dive today into Leviticus 20, we're looking at a worldview where absolute holiness was the non-negotiable rent for living in a God-given land.
It is a comprehensive, airtight system of boundaries. It encompasses the highest levels of worship, demanding the absolute rejection of rival kings like Molech and illicit intelligence like necromancy. It drills down into the foundational family structure, demanding heavy honor for parents as the local governors of the covenant. It governs the most intimate boundaries of sexual ethics to prevent cultural assimilation.
And it even regulates the daily, repetitive act of eating.
Yes, every single action, public or private, was tied directly to their right to remain in the physical space God was giving them.
It's all completely interconnected. Which leaves me with the thought I really want you, the listener, to chew on long after we wrap up today. In the ancient worldview of Leviticus, human morality and the physical environment were deeply, inextricably linked.
They couldn't be separated.
No. If the people corrupted themselves morally, Leviticus argues that the land itself would react. The earth would literally physically expel them to cleanse itself. It makes you wonder, how does this ancient integrated perspective challenge our highly compartmentalized modern view?
That's a great question.
Today, we tend to completely separate our personal, private moral actions from the fate of the physical environment we live in. We think what we do behind closed doors has absolutely no bearing on the dirt beneath our feet.
Right.
But Leviticus argues that you simply cannot separate the two. The moral health of the people and the physical health of the land are one and the same. It's a heavy, challenging concept, and definitely something to think about. And with that, we are going to wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating terrain with us. God blesses all of you listening, and we will catch you next time.